Welcome to our episode of Biblical Archaeology from the Ground Down. Presented by Bible Interact and hosted by Dr. George Sparks. Join us as we explore the fascinating world of the Bible from leading experts in the field of archaeology.
Welcome, people. Today I got a very special guest, Dr. Falk, PhD Egyptologist, our first Egyptologist on the program. Yay! And also we're going to be talking about his book, The Ark of the Covenant in its Egyptian Context, by, of course, Dr. David Falk. My name is Dr. George Sparks. I'm going to be your host, and this is Biblical Archaeology from the Ground Down, sponsored by Bible Interact. Now, I'm going to tell you something about Dr. Falk, Dr. David A. Falk, PhD. His research and interests, he's got Egyptology, history, art, also chronology and archaeology. Now, once again, let me show you something, people. This is 6 pages. I ran out of ink here, so I'm going to do my best in all fairness. Okay, also ancient Near Eastern religion, rituals, and the Hebrew Bible. Education and research. I'm going to start from 1988 when I was just a little boy. 1988 to 1993, a bachelor's in philosophy, University of British Columbia. 2006 to 2009, master's divinity, magna cum laude, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. 2008 to 2010, master Near Eastern and Biblical Archaeology and Language, magna cum laude, Trinity International University. 2010 to 2011, Master's Near and Middle Eastern Civilization, University of Toronto. 2012 to 2015, a PhD in Egyptology, University of Liverpool. Research 2019-2023, Research Associate, Vancouver School of Theology. Current study is Egyptology culture and its intersection with the formation of early Israelite identity. Let's keep on looking here. Awards. Honors. 2016 award FDLR grant by the Department of Classics, Near Eastern and Religious Studies, University of British Columbia. 2013 second place award for the best research poster in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Research Day, University of Liverpool. Now I'm going to go down here because I can't have time for all of it, and I apologize, Doctor, for that. Publications, because this keeps on. This is kind of fun, and 2018 published, 2013 published, 2008. I got to get to this. I got it because this is interesting. Predatory spirituality, vampire religions in America, a critical assessment. Come on, that's now, and is with your wife, Kiara Falk. That one we got to have both of you on the program for that one. That's got to be interesting as heck. Not only that, you know what? It says vampire religions in America. You don't have it in Canada? This is just an American thing right here? Okay. But books 2020. We're going to get into his book today, The Ark of the Covenant in its Egyptian Context, an illustrated journey by Dr. Falk. All right, Dr. Falk, here we keep on going. 2020, computer analytic on chronology testing and its implication for the date of the Exodus. This is why I'm thinking the next one, 2018, the Egyptian sojourn in Exodus. 2016, the significance of the horns of Exodus chapter 27, verse 2, the Egyptians and Levantine four-horn altars. 2014, arrowheads and javelins from Tel El Brog. This is interesting, and it's also edited by James Hoffmeyer. Magazine articles, brick by brick. What did the Israelites build in Egypt? 2015, Egyptian bark shrine and its complexity in its miniaturized sacred space. That's interesting. Now I'm going to skip down because you got 2015, book reviews 2022, 2019, 2018. Review of Douglas Petrovich, the world's oldest Hebrew, or oldest alphabet, Hebrew as the language. is probably a proto-script. But I want to hear about that one too. That sounds like, especially in light of the curse tablet, the lead curse tablet thing. I mean, this is kind of interesting. 2018, what we know about the Egyptian places mentioned in Exodus. 2018 again, what kind of construction did the Israelites do in Egypt? 2022, unpublished conference papers. Now, 2022, I just outlined a few of them, okay? Climate change and identity in the Bronze Age, Semitic culture. Wow, that to me is interesting. Also, information published in 2021, 2023 in 2019, 2018, 2017, and 2017, three more published. Evidence in why the late date of the Exodus is the only possible conclusion. Oh, that's another one right there. 2016. I remember when you did a podcast in Genesis, validating the time period of Abraham using Hammurabi. Is that it?
Robbie.
Abraham trained servants in Genesis 14:14, and the martial arts tradition of the Middle Bronze Age. 2016, rituals, processions, furniture as context for the Ark of the Covenant, probably early part of this book, maybe. 2015, customs in conflict, Hagar, Egyptian understanding of marriage in Genesis 16. This is really interesting stuff here. Now, professional societies. Now, this is last on page 6. Like I said, there's 6 pages here. We got to have time for the podcast and go over your book, too. American Research Center in Egypt, American School of Oriental Research, Evangelical Theological Society, International Association of Egyptologists. Wow. Thank you for being on our program. I'm glad we got an Egyptologist when we're going to talk about the Ark. Well, leading into the Ark of the Covenant. I sent you a list of questions so everybody will know that I'm not just going to try to trick somebody, throw, like trippers in there and see if I can outsmart and that kind of nonsense. No, we're going to go over his book. And I already recommend people, you need to get this book. It's a lot of fun. It's a good read. It's a fun read. It's got a lot of good information that you're never going to see anywhere else. It has to come from an Egyptologist, not just a Near Eastern archaeologist. But I got to tell you one thing before I get going. I had your book on my table and somebody pilfered your book. So I'm going to drop your
that
screen.
Happens.
I'm going to drop your screen real quick at my screen. Now it's just going to be the background because we're going to look for your book, and you can see the little studio that I have right now. And if you look very carefully, we already found your book. I don't believe in ghosts, so if something comes up missing, it's always the mummies. So I would appreciate it at this time if I could have the book back. I know you enjoy reading Dr. Falk's book, but if you can, and I really appreciate it, and you can hang out with your friends and have an unwrapping session or something. But here it is, folks. The Ark of the Covenant in its Egyptian context, an illustrated journey by David A. Falk, PhD. And once again, welcome to your program. Welcome to my program. But great to have you. I got a list of questions.
Okay.
All right, let's start. Is that okay?
That's
Is that
fine
a good
with me.
introduction? Did you like that?
Oh, I really enjoyed that. That was fun. I'm not sure your poor volunteer appreciated it.
Yeah, mummy costume for Halloween, a coffin, kind of like as a studio set.
That's a cool coffin. Where'd you get that?
Well, it's just well, anyway, you can see the front of it right here. Is that cool? Anyway.
That's really cool.
So I thought, hey, he's an Egyptologist. I got an opportunity to use this. So we brought it in and set it up. So
nice.
That's why I had that screen up there with you and your book, because it blocked that way.
Yep.
The mummy has to get in position. But so hopefully everybody enjoyed that, especially you, Doctor. And later on we get this edited and then your wife can see it too. First question, why did you choose to write about the Ark of the Covenant, knowing that you probably had a ton of stuff that would be good Egyptian stuff to write about? Why the Ark of the Covenant?
Okay. This goes back to my dissertation, my PhD dissertation. The book is essentially a outgrowth from my PhD dissertation, which was on ritual processional furniture in ancient Egypt. Now, how I got into that topic was I had done this 30-page dissertation proposal. Big, massive dissertation proposal. More detailed, the better. I submitted it to my advisor, and he said, "Yeah, you'll never finish this. Way too broad. Pick one sentence out of your entire proposal and do your dissertation on that." And it's like, oh, wow, how do I narrow this down? But there was this one sentence from the Bentrash Stela talking about a piece of ritual furniture that had been carried over to the Hittites from Egypt. It's like, okay, that sounds interesting. That sounds really provocative. So it's like, this sort of thing seems to be kind of common in Egyptian culture. So I figured, okay, I'm going to do this context study, this massive, massive context study on Egyptian furniture and see, how does this compare to the Ark of the Covenant? Now, the dissertation is a pretty standard Egyptological work. It doesn't talk about the Ark of the Covenant, except I think in one oblique reference. But it was later on when I started preparing that for publication that it's like, okay, now I can put the Ark of the Covenant back in to that context study, which resulted in our book. So the book is really a re-edit of my dissertation, but with much, much more content focused upon the Ark of the Covenant.
So that explains how it came about. From a dissertation, you had to narrow it down.
I had to narrow it down. Well, it really shocked me. It really shocked me when I did the dissertation. It's like, okay, well, I mean, everyone must have written on the Ark of the Covenant. You figured it's like central in early Israelite religion. So you figured that there'd be tons of publications on this. Nobody had written a serious book on the Ark of the Covenant in about 100 years. It was this lacuna in the scholarly literature that was almost inexplicable. There were lots of garbage publications on junk archaeology, you could call it. These books out there on, well, where is the Ark today? Follow my treasure hunting experiences as we look for the Ark. That kind of literature. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't any serious scholarly works. There was no comparative literature, pretty much, except for maybe a 4-page article done in the 1880s on the Ark of the Covenant as it related to Egyptian furnishing. So it was a topic that hadn't been touched. I mean, it really shocked me that there was still topics like this, as big as, say, the Ark of the Covenant, that hadn't had serious treatment. Even, say, the commentaries and the liberal scholarship, it was basically pretty much down to one-liners like, well, the Ark of the Covenant, no early Bronze Age society could make this. It's just a fable. When, okay, that's kind of weird. We have 3,000 years of furnishing in Egypt, but a Bronze Age society is unable to make this? Maybe we're not giving these cultures their due. So that was sort of the two extremes I found myself in, was treasure hunting versus it's a fable.
Right.
There had to be a more, say, middle ground that was responsible scholastically, responsible with the research.
Right. So you went academic with it. I get it.
Yeah.
The second question.
It did have the virtue of not being tried.
Nice. Second question. Why would people being enslaved in Egypt keep what would be sacred and holy to them but yet place it into an Egyptian style, I'll say ritual container. That'd be if they saw the Egyptian culture as being, you could say, definitely not Yahwistic. And as we read in the scriptural narrative, God takes them away from that culture. Why would they want to take something from that culture and put something very sacred to them in it, which looks very Egyptian? Does that make sense?
Well, it does, but I think we have to be careful here about what God was deprecating in its, say, indictment of, say, of Egyptian thought, Egyptian culture, and Egyptian religion, because it wasn't a blanket thing. It wasn't that everything the Egyptians did was bad. It picked and chose what aspects of culture were bad versus what the Israelites were encouraged to continue doing. Like, for example, the Egyptians didn't eat pork. They weren't pig eaters. The reason why they weren't pig eaters is because it fouled up waterways. Pig farming stinks. I mean, it's terrible for waterways. And Egyptian agriculture depended on clean waterways to make sure that all the agriculture was functioning right. So when the Israelites leave Egypt, they're told, hey, Egyptians didn't eat pork. Continue doing that. That's good. Don't eat pork. But there was other aspects of Egyptian culture that it definitely deprecated. Like, yeah, that adultery thing that the Egyptians did, don't do that. So it really picked and chose what it was, what it selected out of Egyptian culture. Now, we have to remember that the Israelites aren't coming out of Egypt with no religious understanding at all. They had a religious understanding while they lived in Egypt. They had a temple of Baal there that basically the local Semitic population built. So before they left Egypt, they were Baal worshippers. They worshiped Baal, Resheph, and Astarte. So they've already got a temple there. There's already a temple at Avaris where they were living. They were already worshiping a storm deity, Baal. They were using ritual furniture at that temple. Like, for example, we found a plinth at that temple that's dedicated to the god Seth, which is the Egyptian equivalent of Baal. So they already, and what do you put on a plinth? A piece of ritual furniture. So they already know about ritual furniture and have been using it for hundreds of years up until the point of the Exodus. So in many respects, they're just sort of continuing the religious practices that they're already familiar with.
Okay. Question number 2.
If I can add, just because the thing is, they're not going to be doing everything from scratch, because they've got to do things in a certain way to please the deities and to please Yahweh. You have to have ritual space that is sacred. You have to separate that from the space that's profane. You have to do the various offerings to please God. So they're just repurposing, in many ways, the understanding they already know. So and this is not basically making Yahwistic worship pagan. It's repurposing elements and turning it into Yahwistic worship. It's like when we found like when archaeologists found the Hezekiah seal. The Hezekiah seal has an Egyptian Wajid disc.
It does. Mm-hmm.
And 2 ankhs.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's definitely Egyptian symbolism. No doubt that's Egyptian symbolism. But it's being repurposed. for Yahwistic worship. So they're taking the same symbols, the same aspects of the culture that they already knew, religious understanding, and repurposing that for Yahweh worship. It's redeemed. Think of it that way. It's redeemed symbolism. It's redeemed practice.
That's interesting because in talking about the Hezekiah, and you're talking about the bolai, the seal, and it has that Egyptian symbol on it. And Hezekiah is known as the first king of Reformation, and yet we see it. So that's interesting. I always wondered why that would be. The third question. In your book, you had two words in Hebrew used for the ark. Why the different meanings? Why the?
Well, there's different purposes for various kinds of furnishings. Okay, so in the case of the ark, you had a rome, which was it could be a coffer, it could be a coffin, it could be a reliquary. That's one thing. But you also had, say, a teba. Teba. There's various Semitic spellings for it, and that had a seemingly a different function than say the Aron. I'm getting some feedback.
Are you for me?
Yeah. I'm getting an echo of my getting an echo of myself back.
I can't hear it here at all.
Okay. Sure. Let's try that. No. Not getting it. Getting some sort of feedback. Honors are all off. I don't know why.
But let me pause it while you want to look for a while or what? On this side, I'm not hearing anything.
You're not hearing any sort of echo.
Not anything.
So very strange. Okay. Well, I'll just have to live with it.
All right. So we were explaining the two different words for the word ark.
Yeah, and they're used for different kinds of arks. Like the Teba is used for, say, Noah's Ark.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a different function. That's a ritual chest that is used as a sacralizing converter. So it's basically a sacralizing converter is when you take unholy things, stick them in a box, you do a ritual, or you sprinkle some water on the box, you take it into a holy space, you open it up, and everything now is inside the box is now holy. So this is what God. So this is what God's doing, say, with Noah's Ark, is He's taking people and animals and making them fit for His purpose in the new world. In the case of, say, an Aron, the reliquary is actually a place where the 10 Commandments are being deposited. And what you have instead is the most sacred space in that box is not inside the box, it's on top of the box, between the wings of the cherubim. And God is seated over the 10 Commandments at all times. So it's a very different way of manipulating sacred space here. So as I said, with a teba, we'd expect the space to be on the inside of the compartment of the box. With an Aron, not so much. It can be inside, it can be on top. But in the case of the Ark of the Covenant, it's a top, not inside the box.
Maybe for Christian viewers, I don't want to just limit to Christian viewers, but a type of baptism where you submerge yourself and then you come out and there's a kind of a purification in a spiritual sense.
The teba would be like that, yeah. Yeah, think of the teba more like that.
Something similar with the mikvah, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But if I said mikvah to a Christian congregation, they wouldn't have an idea what I meant. But and this is also in Dr. Falk's book, and he explains this. And when I read it, it took a little. I had to read it twice. I said, "Oh, I get it. I understand what's going on now." Let's say question number 4. Oh, this is your imaginative telling of Bezalel, all right, where he is asked to make the sacred items, and you tell the story to bring it into more of a realistic atmosphere, and that type of a narrative. So he looks like more of an individual coming out of an occupied setting, because he's in I don't want to be too deep for the people. He's in a location where Semitic people lived in Egyptian culture called Avaris, and he's coming out of that culture and later being asked to make certain sacred items. Is that fair enough?
That's fair enough. I wanted that story to not just communicate how Bezalel was raised, but also to give the reader an insight of what daily life was like for the Israelites. One of the biggest impediments we have when we talk about a subject like this is we bring our own preconceived notions of what life was like back then into the text. And this can lead to some really odd things sometimes. Like, for example, well, how did, say, the Israelites go from being slaves to being shepherds? You know, when they have to learn that skill? Well, there were already shepherds. The average home in Avaris had sheep. Every household had a small flock of some kind, sheep or goats, you know, which they would use for food and for milk, and because the king didn't necessarily provide them with rations. Yes, they gave them some rations, but it was still incumbent upon every family to provide for itself. So it's not slavery like we would think of it today in the West. You know, it's not like American slavery was in any way. You know, people did at Avaris make their own clothes. We got evidence of looms and loom weights there. So they made their own clothes. They herded their own sheep and goats. So they were making cloth. They were making their own shoes. They were trading goods with one another. So they all had a life, even a ritual life. They had a religious life. They had a domestic life. We kind of see them in some ways very much like they're caricaturized in the films, where, you know, you got Pharaoh there with the big old whip, and when they're not being whipped, they're just huddling in some corner somewhere. That's not the way it worked. They had homes. They had houses. At night, after the mud pits, they would go home. They would sleep in the top floor of their 4-room Semitic house. Bottom floor would be where they corralled your livestock. Some would go and basically buy their child a apprenticeship in a trade. So there was this large, say, domestic life that's going on before the Exodus. So if we start bringing in that understanding of, hey, these are people, they have a domestic life, they're getting married, they're raising kids, they're going to the Baal temple and worshiping, it defrays a lot of sort of the silliness that sometimes enters this conversation because of the caricatures. So that was the real purpose of that story, was to basically give people an idea of what life was like. That puts the whole Exodus story into context.
Right. But that's the way he introduces the individual that's going to make the sacred item through this telling of a story in his book. That's why I'm bringing up the question. So it makes it very unique, very interesting. That leads into it, and it goes into a lot of technical details. Fifth question. Now, this is going to be referring to yesterday, which is August the 12th. You already talked about in yesterday's podcast, why not an early date? Now, when I talked about your research, you were talking about why you go for the late date. But yesterday you talked about why not the early date. And you gave, so I don't want to touch on that right now. People go back to your program, August the 12th, and listen to his program on why not the early date. It's ancient Egypt in the Bible. Go there, subscribe. You're going to learn a lot of material. All right. That being said, what would be a couple reasons for the listening audience for late date? I don't want to give away, but just a couple.
Context. A lot of this just comes down to historical context that we find in the book of Exodus. One of the things that's sort of very difficult to get around is basically the geography of the Exodus route. It's very specific to a certain time and a certain place. Exodus 1:11 says that the Israelites built the cities of storage cities. These are storage magazines at Ramses and Pithom. Now, those are like, let me put it this way. When you do, say, a personal genealogy of your life, okay, of your ancestors, the first thing a genealogist will tell you is it's not enough to know the names of your family. You have to know where they lived to narrow it down, because place has historical context. So when we look at the Exodus route, every city there has historical context. Ramses was not built prior to the 13th century. There was a residence there by Seti I. That's the lowest layer that exists at that site, because it was on an island. It was very easy to sort of go into the stratigraphy there. And then Ramses II built his capital there. Why it's named Ramses? It's named Ramses after Ramses II. Funny how that works. But
Okay.
Ramses was an incredible builder. One of the things he builds is the Ketem fortress and the temple of Atum at Peratum. And he names the site of Cheku Peratum, which is Pithom, P-Tum, like P Ramses, P-Tum, House of Atum. So that name, Pithom, is very specific to Ramses II. We also have 3 places on the Exodus route that can't be earlier than Seti I: Baal-Zephon, Pi-Hahirot, and Migdol. So this begins to narrow down our earliest possible times when the Exodus can take place. We know it's going to be after Seti the First, and it's probably going to be sometime during the reign of Ramses II. The city of Avaris is abandoned mid-dynasty, at least the vast majority of it is going to be abandoned during mid-dynasty 19, when the site becomes a cemetery. Okay? You don't bury dead people amongst the living. It's just something you don't do. Okay? So the majority of the site during mid-dynasty 19 becomes a cemetery. And the thing about mid-dynasty 19 is the vast majority of that dynasty is one person. It's the reign of Ramses II. He reigned 66 years. He has an incredibly long reign. So when you talk about mid-dynasty 19, you're only talking one person, because he's the vast majority of that dynasty. Then you've got the Merneptah Stela on the other end of this. So the city of Ramses gets abandoned about roughly in Ramses II's 25th regnal year. And then a little over 45, 50 years later, we get the first mention of the Israelites in Canaan in the Merneptah Victory Stela. And that dates to 1217 BC. So we've got here a set of bookends. We've got the building of these storage cities. We got the foundation of those cities. We got the renaming of Pithom. We got, on the other end, we got the Merneptah Victory Stela. And in between there, about 60 years. So that narrows down the Exodus pretty tightly.
Okay. Because any more than that, folks, you got to buy the book. So I don't want to tell you all the information. That's no. There's a spoiler alert there. No way.
Well, it is richly illustrated. They won't get the illustrations if they don't buy the book.
But also, for this, when I started it off, I said, well, yesterday you talked about the podcast. Why not the early date? And now you gave a couple reasons why the late date. But also, one could go to your podcast, Ancient Egypt and the Bible, and look up the debate between you and Dr. Titus Kennedy. Now, I'm not talking about, necessarily whose tail's longer than the other. I suggest it just for the academic reason, because we want to know. And I was very impressed. I've listened to it many times. I think I even sent you something. You said, "Oh, my algorithm will be pleased with you." I think that was your response. I said, "I think this is the 5th time I listened to it, because I'm just keep on writing down more information." So now we're going to go to number 6. This is where you talked about the ritual furniture in your book. Now, he doesn't talk about 1 or 2 pieces of furniture. He doesn't talk about just the Ark of the Covenant as ritual furniture. It gives a list of the different types of furniture and its usage in the Egyptian culture. All right. So it's pretty in detail with that. But you also use this phrase starting off with ritual furniture as a status symbol. Why would furniture be a status symbol? You gave the reference to, how about a Ferrari? Yeah, Ferrari would be a good status symbol. A Maserati? Maybe. Okay. But here you said furniture is a status symbol. And you gave some, I think, in our culture, some humble examples, such as a bed, a chair. But in Egyptian culture, when we go to the museum and see what King Tut had, well, that's pretty unique. Could you explain that briefly? What is the status symbol of furniture?
It's in the ancient world, furniture has always been a luxury item. It's always been a luxury item. We see this even in the Old Testament when the northern kingdom of Israel is critiqued for having couches of ivory. Okay? They've got so much wealth, they're putting ivory inlays in their couches. So it's always been a status symbol in the ancient Near East. And it was expensive. In Egypt, wood was an expensive commodity. A lot of it had to be imported. So anytime you're importing goods, it's going to cost more. That's just basic economics. It's a supply and demand thing. Less supply is going to increase the price of everything. So in the case of, say, furniture, you don't have a lot of domestic species of trees in Egypt. There's a few like acacia, but it gets to a certain point where they're starting to run low on this stuff. In fact, the supply of wood gets so bad at the end of the 19th, early 20th dynasty that people have to start stealing each other's coffins because wood is so scarce they can't make new coffins. So they're tomb robbing, taking people's coffins, reusing them in Dynasty 21. So it gets that bad in Egypt for that the supply of wood is at such a premium. So when we talk about a luxury good, we are going to be talking about chests and tables, chairs. There's even, say, a certain Middle Kingdom prophecy text that, where it's describing the world turned upside down. And it talks about these poor people who don't have clothes, now own a chest. Because that's the luxury good of their day. So, when you were showing your status, you weren't showing it by, as I said, things that we would have in our day. They would show it by things they had in their day. And for them, those status of items were pieces of furniture, whether a bed, because the average person slept on the floor. The average person ate on the floor. We see, as ridiculous as it sounds, when we look at, say, Da Vinci's Last Supper. Okay, and everyone's sitting at a table in chairs. That would have been the Elon Musk of Last Suppers in Christ's day. Christ's day, the Passover would have been eaten on the floor. They would have probably thrown down a rug. They might have had a wood tray to serve food on, but there was no tables, no chairs. That's rich man's stuff. So, like, for example, when we hear about Lazarus, being thrown breadcrumbs from the rich man's table, we hear table and we just sort of, it's an invisible word for us. But that's a sign of his wealth and his status, that he had these things that nobody else had. So when we talk about all these status items, like chests, like tables, like chairs, and that sort of thing, we do have to keep it in its context of its day, because not everybody had these. In fact, the vast majority of people didn't own this stuff. It's a stuff. Your typical farmer in ancient Egypt had basically a bowl and a spoon made of wood. One was made of wood, and that was the vast majority of his worldly goods. He might have had a mat to lay on, but it's very, very, we don't understand in our modern society how few possessions people had back then.
That's interesting, because I remember a photograph from a Middle Bronze Age tomb from Jericho. It had like a mat and it had a table in the tomb.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe it's actually on display in the museum, but that's a good point to put it in context.
Yeah. People were
So they
poor.
even had a Elon Musk back in those days. Yeah, that's good to
Yeah,
know too.
they had the equivalent of Elon Musk's back then too. There's always been the rich, and there's always been the poor. But
Right.
the rich had furniture. They had beds. They had chairs. They had tables. They had chests.
Yeah. See, I would suppose that everybody would have that. In my mind, everybody had that. Okay, they did.
Well,
The
think
next
about
question I'm
how
going to get.
rapid. Sorry.
Go
Well,
ahead. Go
think
ahead.
about how rapidly it had changed. Where by the Renaissance, the vast majority of people had tables and chairs.
Mhm.
So it changed very, very rapidly. That that this conception we have today, already by the Renaissance, people were already seeing this, where people were no longer, say, eating on the floor. Now, a lot of this is also influenced by our Western thought as well. In Western Europe, there was a surplus of wood. People could make their own tables, could make their own chairs. In the Middle East, where you didn't have a surplus of wood, it was scarce, it was precious, and thus it was expensive.
Your next question I get from page 37 of your book, which you have illustrated the Temple of Karnak. Now I'm going to use the word proto-Israel. Maybe we're thinking of the time of the judges. Some say proto-Israel. If proto-Israel, they have the Egyptian ark. So it's an item of furniture similar to what was in Egypt, like you're saying. Then how come the Egyptians don't have an Egyptian style temple like we see in Karnak? They have more of a Phoenician style temple. Can I show this page?
Yes, certainly.
That'd be okay?
Yep.
Okay, there it is right there. The temple of Karnak from this page. See how colorful the pictures are and everything. But so what I'm saying is if they're using the ark and it's an item, a style from Egypt, then why not the temple as well? Why not similar structure rather than
Okay.
Phoenician?
Well, the temple was built hundreds of years later. First of all, the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem was built hundreds of years after the Israelite conquest. When they leave Egypt, they are building things in an distinctly Egyptian design pattern. So when they take, for example, the altar, okay, the altar's a burnt offering. It's essentially acacia wood covered in bronze cladding. That was the Egyptian style, was metal over wood. As soon as they enter the land, they start building altars out of stone. They basically rapidly adapt to their new environment. So while they're in Egypt, they are viewing things through an Egyptian ritual lens. So they're viewing things through a ritual lens. They're constructing things in Egyptian ways. But as soon as they're in the land of Canaan, they start adapting to Canaanite understandings of, say, ritual and sacred space. So the temple layout in, say, around the 10th century is going to be very, very different than what the tabernacle layout is going to be like in, say, the 13th century. They're different contexts, different periods of time, and they're in different locations. So,
Okay.
so it's a different different inculcation of culture.
All right. Now, in question number 8, and I actually sent you this as well, because when I wrote down the question, I realized I probably should have asked this first before I start talking about a temple. Does the tabernacle used in the wilderness, as they came out of Egypt, the tabernacle in the wilderness, does its design resemble any type of design in tent structures from Egypt, such as maybe the Middle or the intermediate, the New Kingdom period? Does it represent any tent structure from the 18th or 19th dynasty where we can narrow it down? Like, well, if this tent, like you mentioned, the structures that were built in the location of Ramses, they can't date any older than the time period of Seti I. So you can focus in on that. All right. Or could we do the same thing for a tent structure? Can we say these tent designs only existed in the 19th dynasty, or they only existed in the 18th dynasty, or it really isn't an Egyptian design at all? It's just a tent. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. The thing is, we've got, in the case of ritual furniture, we've got hundreds of examples of iconography and actual boxes and components of these ritual chests. We got a lot of evidence for that, and it stretches over 3,000 years. So we can easily create a typology of them very, very simply, because we've got so many examples. We don't have as many examples of tents. We do know they exist. We do know that they are used with ritual furniture because we do see them in the iconography, although an incomplete view of them. We have a couple of extant examples, one from the tomb of Hetep Heres, one that was attached to the solar barks of Khufu, but we don't have enough examples of them to create a typology. Because we can't create a typology, it's very difficult to date. So in the case of, say, those tent furniture, tabernacle structures, for lack of a better word, it's very difficult to date them. We know they go back to the Old Kingdom at least. They're still being used in the New Kingdom. But we can't exactly pinpoint them down in the same way we can do, say, furniture, just because we've got so much more data with furniture. Got a lot of data. In fact, this is what the comparison I like using when I talk about, say, the furniture aspect of this, is we have so much data, it's like a movie. Okay, so let's say you make a movie. Okay, you've got a reel, and then somebody on your set takes a photograph, snapshot of the actors on the set itself. You can go back into the movie and take your photograph if you have no other data, and you can say, okay, this photograph matches this frame of the film, this piece of the film. So we can narrow down furniture in that way because we've got so much furniture. The furniture of Egypt is like the movie. The Ark of the Covenant is like the snapshot. So this is why we can date the Ark of the Covenant according to basically the movie. Because we have that wealth of knowledge. But we don't have that for tabernacles. We've got a picture of a tabernacle-like structure, which was Ramses' war tent. It's found at the Ramesseum and at Abu Simbel. Okay, so we do have that, where there seems to be a tent within a tent. So you've got that. So that's very contemporary with what the Exodus would have been.
So in Ramses' war tent, since you mentioned that, since he would be a son of a divine, would there be like the tent, and then there would be like a place where people would go in, the common person, and then you got a place where like Ramses would be as a pharaoh, and then maybe Ramses would have a shrine in his tent. So that might be I'm just making this stuff up, but I'm just wondering, because in your mind, if you're picturing that tent that was on the wall, maybe was there any indication of something like that? Like
we don't have the details of what was inside the tent. I wish we did. That would be cool. Okay,
that would be cool.
But we do have that tent within the tent structure. Right. But more importantly, in other reliefs, we do have furniture which is surrounded by a tent. It's going to be surrounded by a veil. It's going to be surrounded by a tent. And I think this is really interesting that in a lot of these cases with a lot of these furnishings, like the sacred barks, you barely notice it, but there's a tent over the shrine. And the shrine itself is wrapped with a veil. So think of it kind of like this. You've got the outside of your tabernacle. That's your outer tent. You've got a shrine in the center. That's your tent of meeting, your holy of holies. You got a veil around it. It's the same language, same ritual language being used from Egypt into Israel.
Okay. Got it. Let's see, question number 9. I think this is the last question. I wrote down, I said, I know your answer to the question, but everybody's going to ask this, right? You know, it's going to be, where is the ark? Where's the ark? In your opinion, where's the ark? Now, your answer is in your book, but is it on Mount Nebo? Is it in Ethiopia? Is it under the Temple Mount? Is it back in Zoan like Indiana Jones? Zoan, I think that's the biblical name for it. Zoan.
That's Tanis, yeah.
Or Tanis, yes. So in your opinion, what would you say to these? Nebo, Ethiopia, the Temple Mountain, Tanis.
Okay, a few things. Well, let's start with Tanis. Okay. This is the idea that Shoshank came, plundered the Egyptian gold, and then basically took it all back to Tanis. Okay. And there is some reference to this in both, say, the Book of Kings as well as on the Bubastite portal. Okay. Where he makes this massive contribution to the god Amun-Ra. Now, in the case of what he was bribed, because he didn't plunder the temple, he was bribed to go away. Basically given all the treasure and basically said, there's nothing more for you to plunder. Go home. The amount of gold that's mentioned in those texts is much, much less than would be found on the Ark of the Covenant. So it couldn't include the Ark of the Covenant all on its own. Moreover, the last sighting we have of the Ark of the Covenant is actually during the reign of King Josiah. That's the last sighting we have of the Ark of the Covenant, is during the reign of Josiah. So obviously Shoshank didn't take it off to Tanis. Now, the Ethiopian one. Let's talk about Ethiopia and Our Lady of Zion Church. Okay. Now, this comes out of a 13th century AD text called the Kebra Nagast. And basically, it's a hodgepodge of various figures in literary and biblical history that have been sort of cut and pasted together in sort of a synchronic way. So, but it's the text that sort of recounts the queen of Sheba, who we're supposed to believe is the queen of Aksum. Okay, goes to Jerusalem, seduces Solomon, goes back, has a son comes back with a copy of the Ark of the Covenant. They make the switcheroo, and he takes the real one back to Aksum. And thus, the royalty of Aksum is the divinely manifested royalty that will survive the ages. It was basically a document that was designed to prop up a failing dynasty, essentially. Sheba is not Aksum. It's across the water in the Arabian Peninsula. There's no evidence that the Queen of Sheba ever had any sort of relations with Solomon. In fact, that would have probably ended up in her death, honestly. She was a minor queen at best. The other thing is that the supposed ark that is in St. Mary's Church has been seen by a Westerner. Edward Uhlendorf in 1941 actually saw what was claimed to be the real Ark of the Covenant in Ethiopia. And he described it as a 13th century AD replica of what was called a teba. Now, we've talked a little bit earlier about teba before. The Ethiopians call it tabo. A tabo is a ritual chest that contains some holy item that's used in a church. Kind of like in some ways the way that some Western churches have altars. Now, these things are not big. They're very small. They're usually about 18 inches by 18 inches by about 8 inches. Much, much smaller than the Ark of the Covenant would have been. So there's no way that what's found at St. Mary's Church is the Ark of the Covenant. Not possible. And Uhlendorf was an expert in Ethiopic studies, so he would have known, he would have been able to recognize the real Ark of the Covenant if he had. So this was no slouch. This guy was no slouch who saw it. And it was just after he saw it, just after the end of World War II. So after the fascist Italians were driven out of Ethiopia, the British came in and occupied the country for a while. And he was part of that military group. He was a British officer. So that, I think, covers the Ethiopian one. So there's no way the Ethiopian one would have been at any. Again, it's also denied by the fact that, again, Josiah was the last king to see it. A lot of these theories are going to be sort of disgrounded just because of that Josiah sighting. Now, in the case of Mount Nebo, I wouldn't place a high stock in that. It's a very late recounting. It's found in Maccabees. It's so it's just, I don't think it's a good source either. As far as it being under the Temple Mount, okay. Yeah. Now, this was interesting. This is interesting because this comes out of the Talmud, okay. And there's two accounts given in the Talmud. One account says it's under the Temple Mount. The other account says it was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. They both can't be right. Now, Yehuda Getz claimed to have seen it under the Temple Mount. But Yehuda Getz is not a reliable witness either. I mean, the same thing was said by Ron Wyatt. Ron Wyatt claimed to have seen the Ark of the Covenant under Gordon's cavalry. But again, not a reliable witness. I think that covers it.
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. I was hoping that you'd definitely say it's on Mount Nebo or somewhere in that neighborhood, or we could call it somewhere in the neighborhood.
Neighborhood.
All right. So we're going to leave it at the time period of Josiah, the last that's been seen. However, if you want the entire answer, you got to buy the book, because your answer, we deliberately did this, folks. Get the book. Find the answers. All right. And it's a lot of fun to read. Once again, here's this book right here, The Ark of the Covenant. In its Egyptian context, an illustrated journey. And I showed you like a couple pictures, but it's heavily illustrated. It's a beautiful book. I recommend that everybody gets it. Go to Egypt and the Bible and subscribe. Do it right now. Don't wait. And Dr. Falk, thank you so much for your time. I would love to have you on the program again, because just reading your academic journey and what you've been through, there's so much you can share. And I say that not because I read that, but also actively watching your program myself, which led me to say, I need this gentleman on my program. And I'm so happy that you had this opportunity to share your book and your experience and your knowledge with us. And it truly, truly is a wonderful moment for me, because I stayed up all night saying, I hope this doesn't mess up.
Well,
But I
thank you
like to
for
have,
having
you
me.
got so many topics out there that I love for the people to have on the program that we have here. Now, this is what I'd like to do. I'm going to say this real quick so everybody knows. I wouldn't ask you to do this if I couldn't find a sponsor to have you on to do it, because I'd love to have you do, and it would take some time. Why not the early Exodus? Why the late date? Who are the Sashu? The time period of Abraham? Something along that line. That I've watched your program. These were some just off the top of my head that have always been so fascinating, and you had just a ton of good information to share with everybody. So hopefully sometime in the future that you can be back and explain these things to the group that we have here. And believe me, you need to go over there, Ancient Egypt and the Bible, and subscribe, because it's a wonderful channel. How long have you been active? Has it been 3 years or more?
It's been 4 now. We
Okay.
started because of the pandemic.
Okay.
I was an adjunct professor, and my first book had just gone to press. So when you get your first book out there, kind of in that awkward state, you can't really start pitching a second book because you don't know how the first one's selling. So it was like, okay, well, what am I going to do with my time? Everyone's in lockdown. They let go all the adjuncts. They shut down the schools. Everyone's at home in a forced lockdown situation. Like, I'm not the type of person that can sit still. I have to do something with my time always. I'm a workaholic. So I was like, okay, let's start a YouTube channel. Let's see, we might get a couple hundred subscribers eventually. Really niche topic. Nobody will watch it. Yeah, sure, right.
Yeah, I know you're up to like 14,000 subscribers right now.
Yeah, we just hit 14,000.
Hopefully we on this program. Hopefully we will change that for you. Get over there, people, subscribe. I'm not going to say help him out. He does need helped out, but you're going to learn something if you go over there and subscribe. Like I said, there's lots of archaeologists, Near Eastern archaeologists. There's not a lot of Egyptologists out there lending us their knowledge and comparing that to the scriptural narrative. And sometimes I would say keeping us out of the maybe some pseudo academics that we still have in Near Eastern archaeology. And because we don't have Egyptologists, and we still fall into that same dilemma. Not all of us, but definitely this information is getting out there because of Dr. David Falk. And sir, thank you so much for your time and what you've been doing for the last 4 years. And I'm glad it's going great for you, and much more success.
My pleasure.
All right. Thank you for your time, Doc. Have a great day.
You too.